It's great to have back on the program attorney and co-host of Ring of Fire, Mike Papantonio. We are here today to talk about his new book, Law and Disorder. Pap, I'm about halfway through the book. I love thrillers of all kinds, and this is a thriller that it doesn't exist in a completely fictional world, sadly, because much of what's in the book relates to the real state of corporate power and so many of the other issues that you work on in your legal practice. Talk to us first about the process here. Is the idea that it is loosely based around your work? Is it, talk to us about that.
Yeah, the cases involved in that book are actual cases that have taken place, but they're fictionalized only to the extent of, as you point out, it's a thriller. It's the idea is to be able to entertain and at the same time tell stories that there's no way on earth corporate media would ever tell because their advertisers won't let them tell the story. So what I've done is I've taken cases that I've actually handled. These are, we have a specialty with what I do. It's handling complex cases. There's only a handful of us in the country that do it. There are complex environmental cases, complex pharmaceutical cases, whistleblower cases, those type, Wall Street cases. We don't handle, auto cases. So the stuff that we've handled for 35 years is all complex, and they all lend themselves to great stories. So what I've done is taken that, David, and I've put it into a fiction that, fortunately, apparently people like it. It's selling very well, and the reviews on it have been extraordinary.
So. Yeah, to call it a page turner is definitely an understatement. I mean, I am riveted by it, and I already know some of the stories that are being alluded to or directly discussed. What's your process here? So when you sat down to do this, I've talked to authors who have done novels where they basically just start writing at the beginning. They just get into the writing. And I know other authors who chart out the sort of story arc in total before they start actually fleshing it out. What was your process?
With these kinds of books, there's 3 of them, by the way. This is the first one, and there's 2 more coming on also very similar kinds of huge, complex cases. But the story's written because the case has already taken place, and I simply take that and I build the framework around that. I begin it and I land the story before I go too far down the road because the story is actually put together. The difficulty of course, in any fiction I find is the narratives have got to be convincing narratives. How do people really talk? What would they really say in a conversation? And so I think the narrative plug-in is probably, to me, I think it's probably the most challenging, unless you do it a lot. I'm a news editing major from University of Florida. I was intended to be a journalist and actually work in the area of journalism. But there's always a discussion. If you can't, the idea is, show me, don't tell me. I know you've heard that before probably, but show me, don't tell me is something that you hear good trial lawyers are always going to be talking about. Don't tell the jury what you want them to understand. Show them the picture, show them the document, show them where this all leads. And I think in writing a book like this, it's important to show them by way of dialogue and by way of narratives, rather than just telling the story about a corporate, corrupt corporation that killed people. And so you can do that a lot of different ways.
I can only imagine that one of the difficulties, and I'm saying difficulty sort of tongue in cheek, is when you talk about a screenplay or a novel, there's this tendency to not want to create overly crazy or unbelievable scenarios because sometimes we hear this phrase, this would not even be believable as a movie. But in some of these cases that you've actually worked on, when it comes to corporate corruption and the crazy things that go on behind the scenes, it is almost unbelievable, but unfortunately, it's all too real.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem. That's why the books like this are important, David. Grisham, I thought, did a really good job, especially when we first started writing, telling stories that there's no way that corporate media or newspapers are going to tell you. They can't. Their advertisers won't let them. And so sometimes when you run a story, like for example in that particular book, I talk about a pharmaceutical that kills young women between 18 and 35. It's a birth control. Well, I remember calling the media about that once we started seeing that trend, and I would call NBC or CBS or one of the folks. We had our PR people doing that, and it was they didn't believe the story. And it wasn't clear to me whether they didn't run the story that would have saved hundreds of lives had they gone ahead and done what we asked them to do, and that is to publicize the story. It would have saved hundreds of lives. It wasn't clear to me whether their advertiser wouldn't let them do that, or whether the story simply sounded so remarkable that they didn't believe it was true. But it was true. And all of these stories that will be told in these 3 books are true. And I want to be very clear. I put barnacles on lawyers where barnacles have to be there. In the next book, for example, I really go after a handful of plaintiffs' lawyers, claimants' lawyers that I think are doing such a disservice to democracy in the way that they're, it's almost like wholesale practice of law, and it's killing the process. And so I go after them. I go after judges that understand clearly that they're not really judges. They're really politicians with black robes that simply are reflecting their ideology rather than making judicial kinds of decisions. I go after the industry regulators. Look, there's so many stories to tell, and that's why I thought it was necessary to have 3 books to tell all of the stories. And they're all about different cases, but they all tell stories that there is no way on earth the average reader would know about these stories without reading a book like this.
Well, people who are more familiar with, number one, some of the people associated with your law firm, number 2, some of these cases, as they read the book, they'll recognize some of the names. I know there's a character named David Pakman, but there's also other characters where the names have been changed a little bit more. And to that end, are there people that you've heard from, or directly or indirectly, who are not pleased with some of what is being described in this book? Because you are telling a lot.
I haven't heard from them, but some of them I was pretty unkind to, and I'm sure they're not going to be pleased. But if they're not pleased with this one, get ready for the second one. The truth is, you have to tell these stories. I think it's really wrong for a fiction writer to use that fiction edge and somehow bury the truth. I mean, every story has some truths. Okay, it is not the truth about what happened, A, B, and C, but what is the truth about the theme of what occurred in A, B, and C. And I think you have to be truthful with yourself when you see somebody in your own business doing something wrong. You got to talk about it. You have to take the risk, and you have to talk about a federal judge who slept through a horrendous case that and then make a ruling without any knowledge of what they just heard, or a regulator with the EPA or FDA that we know is nothing more than a pharmaceutical pimp, a corporate pimp, doing nothing but pimping for industry. You have to talk about those stories in fiction, just like you would in any narrative that you might do day to day. You tell real stories. These are real stories, David, but they're just dressed up in a way that it's a fiction.
Last thing I want to ask about, and this is completely just me being interested in the process here. You had a situation where, because you're fictionalizing real cases, like you said, a lot of it is sort of written by the reality of the cases. But what were the biggest changes in the book from maybe the first draft to what ultimately ended up being published? Were they character changes? Were they including or removing certain parts? I mean, what were the biggest changes that you ended up making?
The biggest thing is the removal. The most difficult thing is, fortunately, I had great editors. I had wonderful editors. And at the end of it, I would look at something that's left on the floor and I'd say, gee, I really like that. You know, I thought it was really important. But what you have to do, you have to have truth. You have to be truthful with yourself about what the editor is trying to say. In a fiction, the key is to turn the page. You're not writing a Mishner novel where he's talking about everything you want to know about a pineapple. You know, everything you want to know about a particular item. Mishner was wonderful about that, but it's not fiction. It's not a page turner. And so the difficulty, I think, for any fiction writer, if they have a good editor, is saying, you know what, you really know what you're doing. I'm going to go with you on this. We'll drop that scene from the book and move on.
The book is Law and Disorder. We've been speaking with the book's author, attorney, and Ring of Fire co-host Mike Papantonio. You can, of course, get the book through our recommendations page at davidpakman.com and also using the link in the description to this video if you are watching on YouTube. Pap, I'm enjoying it. Thanks so much for talking to us about it.
Thank you, David.